At 05:30 hours on August 17, 1943, Technical Sergeant Robert Dutch Keller stood beside a B-17F Flying Fortress at Framlingham Airfield in Suffolk, England, watching 40 gallons of aviation fuel drain into a steel drum. The fuel wasn't going back into the bomber. It was going into a separate container that Keller had hidden behind the maintenance hangar for the past 2 weeks. The fuel was stolen, and in 6 hours, it was going to save 30 lives. The B-17 beside him was tail number 4230196, nicknamed Nip and Tuck. It belonged to the 394th Bomb Group, part of the 4th Bombardment Wing. In 3 hours, this aircraft and 145 others would take off on the longest, most dangerous mission the 8th Air Force had ever attempted. Target: the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg, 430 miles inside occupied Europe. After bombing, they wouldn't return to England. They'd continue south over the Alps, across the Mediterranean, and land at airfields in Algeria. Total distance: over 1,500 miles. No B-17 had ever flown that far in combat. The problem was fuel. More specifically, the problem was that regulation 100-octane aviation gasoline would not get them there. Keller had done the math 17 times. He'd calculated fuel consumption rates, cruise speeds, combat power settings, and formation flying inefficiencies. Every calculation arrived at the same conclusion. At least 30 aircraft would run out of fuel over the Mediterranean Sea or the North African desert. The crews would die. Not from German fighters, not from flak, from empty fuel tanks. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Keller had been a mechanic with the 394th since April. Before that, he'd worked for Standard Oil in Bayonne, New Jersey. He understood petroleum chemistry better than most engineers. He knew that aviation fuel wasn't a single substance. It was a carefully blended mixture of hydrocarbons with specific additives: tetraethyl lead to prevent engine knock, aromatic compounds to boost octane rating, stabilizers to prevent gum formation. The standard fuel issued to bomber units was rated 100 octane for lean mixture, 130 octane for rich mixture. It was good fuel, but it wasn't optimal for extreme range missions. The Wright Cyclone R 18-2097 engines on the B-17F were designed for high-altitude performance, not fuel efficiency. At 25,000 feet, each engine consumed approximately 50 gallons per hour at cruise power. 4 engines, 50 gallons each, 200 gallons total per hour. With Tokyo tanks installed, a B-17F carried 36 30 gallons maximum. That gave roughly 18 hours of flight time under ideal conditions. But combat wasn't ideal. Formation flying increased fuel consumption by 15%. Evasive maneuvers burned even more. And nobody knew how long the Regensburg force would circle over North Africa waiting for landing clearance. Keller had access to something the official fuel supply system didn't provide: 131 octane fuel. It came from a batch intended for P-47 Thunderbolt fighters. The higher octane rating allowed for leaner cruise mixtures without detonation, which reduced fuel consumption by approximately 8%. 8% didn't sound like much, but on a 1,500-mile mission, 8% was the difference between landing in Algeria and ditching in the sea. The problem was regulations. Bomber crews were specifically prohibited from using fighter-grade fuel. The reasoning was sound. Fighter fuel cost more to produce, was in shorter supply, and contained additives that could cause long-term deposits in engines designed for standard aviation, gasoline. Using it required authorization from Wright Field Engineering Command in Ohio, and Wright Field was 4,000 miles away. Keller had submitted a formal request on August 1st. He'd explained the fuel consumption problem. He'd shown his calculations. He'd detailed how 30 bombers, approximately 300 men, might not make it to Algeria on standard fuel. The response came back 8 days later. Request denied. Use of non-standard fuel grades requires extensive engine testing. Maintain current fuel protocols. So, Keller stole the fuel. Not all at once. Small quantities. 40 to 60 gallons at a time, drained from fighter aircraft that came through for maintenance. He stored it in drums behind the hangar, covered with canvas tarps, marked as contaminated fuel pending disposal. Nobody questioned it. Contaminated fuel was common. Water in the tanks, sediment, rust. Mechanics dealt with it constantly. By August 15th, Keller had accumulated 480 gallons of 100 to 31 octane fuel, not enough to fill 30 B-17 seconds, but enough to make a difference. His plan was simple: blend the high-octane fuel with standard fuel in a ratio that would boost the effective octane rating without causing engine problems. The blend would go into specific aircraft with the longest flight times, the ones most likely to run out of fuel. The chemistry was straightforward. Mix 1 part 131 octane fuel with 3 parts 100 octane fuel. The result: approximately 108 octane effective rating, high enough to allow leaner cruise mixtures, low enough to avoid detonation problems. But mixing fuel wasn't like mixing paint. Aviation fuel had to meet precise specifications: vapor pressure, freezing point, aromatic content. Get it wrong, and engines would fail, possibly catastrophically. Keller tested the blend on August 14th. He mixed 60 gallons in a drum, ran it through a makeshift filtration system, tested the specific gravity with a hydrometer. The numbers looked right, but numbers on paper weren't the same as an engine running at 25,000 feet with the temperature at -50 degrees Fahrenheit. He needed to flight test it. At midnight on August 15th, he approached Lieutenant James O'Brien, pilot of Hell's Kitchen, a B-17F from the 545th Squadron. Keller and O'Brien had history. O'Brien's aircraft had taken flak damage over Bremen in July. The number 3 engine had seized. Keller had worked 16 straight hours replacing it, got the aircraft flight ready in time for the next mission. O'Brien remembered. Keller explained the situation: the fuel shortage, the Regensburg mission, the unauthorized blend. O'Brien listened without interrupting. When Keller finished, O'Brien asked one question: "Will it get us to Africa?" Keller said he thought so. O'Brien said, "Then do it." On August 16th, O'Brien flew a test mission, not combat mission, a navigation training flight over the North Sea. The fuel load was 50-50, half standard fuel, half Keller's blend, 4 hours, at various power settings and altitudes. When O'Brien landed, he reported no engine abnormalities. Fuel consumption was 7.3% lower than standard calculations predicted. The blend worked. Keller made his decision. He would fuel 30 aircraft from the 394th and 395th bomb groups with his blend. Not the entire fuel load. That would be too obvious. He'd top off the Tokyo tanks with the blend after the official fueling was complete. The Tokyo tanks held 1080 gallons. With 480 gallons of high-octane fuel, he could give each of 30 aircraft approximately 16 gallons of pure 131 octane, which, when mixed with the standard fuel already in the tanks, would raise the effective octane just enough. The night of August 16th, Keller and 3 other mechanics he'd brought into the plan began the work. They moved between aircraft in the darkness, connecting hoses, pumping fuel. Each aircraft took about 12 minutes. They worked in silence, no flashlights, feeling their way by touch and memory. By 0300 hours on August 17th, 30 B-17 seconds carried Keller's fuel. The mechanics left no documentation, no fuel logs, no maintenance entries. If the mission succeeded, nobody would ask questions. If it failed, they'd all face court-martial. At 0600 hours, the crews began their pre-flight briefings. The mission details shocked everyone. Regensburg wasn't just deep, it was suicidal. 430 miles into Germany without fighter escort for most of the route. Then another 900 miles over the Alps and Mediterranean to North Africa. Flying time, approximately 9 hours. The planners called it a shuttle mission, as if giving it a name made it less insane. The weather over England was terrible: ground fog, drizzle, visibility less than a quarter mile. The original plan called for simultaneous takeoff, with another force attacking Schweinfurt. The two forces would split German fighter defences, but the Schweinfurt force remained grounded, waiting for the fog to lift. The Regensburg force couldn't wait. If they delayed, they'd arrive over North Africa after dark with no navigation aids. Colonel Curtis LeMay, commander of the 4th Bombardment Wing, made the call. They'd go alone. At 0721, the first B-17 climbed into the murk. Instrument takeoff, through 2 layers of overcast, crews praying they wouldn't collide during formation assembly. Keller watched from the ground as aircraft after aircraft disappeared into the grey ceiling. Nip and Tuck took off at 0738. Hell's Kitchen, at 0742, 30 modified aircraft spread across 4 squadrons. The formation assembled over East Anglia at 15,000 feet, 146 bombers in combat boxes, each box a tight formation designed for mutual defensive fire. At 0800 hours, they turned east toward the North Sea. 87 P-47 Thunderbolts fell in as escort. The fighters could only stay until the German border. After that, the bombers would be alone. What Keller didn't know, what nobody knew yet, was that the Germans were waiting. Luftwaffe radar had tracked the formation from takeoff. Fighter controllers scrambled every available aircraft across western Germany. 300 Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, the largest defensive fighter force Germany had ever assembled. The bombers crossed the Dutch coast at 0915. The P-47s turned back 15 minutes later, low on fuel. The first German fighters appeared at 0945. A dozen Bf-109s diving from altitude, head-on attacks, 20mm cannons firing. The combat boxes tightened. 50 caliber machine guns hammered. The sky filled with tracers and smoke. For the next 90 minutes, the bomber force fought its way across Germany. Continuous attacks, waves of fighters hitting from every angle. Aircraft fell. Some exploded. Some spun down, trailing fire. Parachutes blossomed. By the time the formation reached Regensburg at 11:43, 15 B-17 seconds were gone. 13 more were heavily damaged. The bombing run was textbook, clear visibility, minimal flak. The Norden bomb sites locked onto the factory complex. At 11:43, 126 bombers released 298.75 tons of bombs, high explosives and incendiaries. The factory disappeared in smoke and flame, every major building hit. But there was no time to assess damage. More fighters were coming. The formation turned south, toward Austria and the Alps. German fighters pursued but broke off after 20 minutes, low on fuel and ammunition. The bombers climbed to clear the mountains. 19,000 feet over the Brenner Pass, temperature -42 degrees Fahrenheit. Crews on oxygen, electrically heated suits, struggling against the cold. By 1300 hours, the formation was over northern Italy, descending toward the Mediterranean. This was the critical phase. Fuel consumption calculations had always been theoretical. Now they became real. Pilots checked their gauges. Some showed comfortable margins, others were dropping faster than predicted. Several aircraft began to lag behind the formation, unable to maintain speed, conserving fuel. At 13:45, the first aircraft ditched. Dangerous Deb, a B-17F from the 385th Bomb Group, ran out of fuel 50 miles off the Italian coast. The crew sent a mayday, deployed life rafts, went down in the sea. Rescue would take hours, if it came at all. 20 minutes later, 2 more aircraft ditched, both from squadrons that hadn't received Keller's fuel, blend. By 14:30 hours, 5 bombers were down in the Mediterranean. The survivors pressed on, engines running on fumes, pilots nursing every gallon. The aircraft with Keller's blend flew differently. The pilots noticed it without understanding why. Fuel gauges dropped more slowly than expected. Engines ran smoothly at leaner mixture settings that normally would have caused rough running. On Hell's Kitchen, Lieutenant O'Brien watched his fuel totalizer and realized they were going to make it. Barely, but they'd make it. At 1500 hours, the formation crossed the North African coast. Airfields at Telagma, Bertaux, and bone appeared ahead. Aircraft peeled off, individual bombers heading for the nearest runway. Some landed with less than 50 gallons remaining. Others touched down with tanks reading empty, running on fumes in the fuel lines. Hell's Kitchen landed at Telegma at 15:18 hours. When the engines shut down, O'Brien checked the fuel gauges. 73 gallons remaining. According to standard calculations, they should have been bone dry over the Mediterranean. The extra fuel had saved them. Across the 3 airfields, ground crews swarmed the arriving bombers. Fuel trucks rolled. Damage assessment teams counted bullet holes. 30 aircraft were mission-capable with repairs. 16 needed major work. The rest were written off. Of the 146 B-17 seconds that took off from England, 24 never made it to Africa. 10 shot down over Germany. 5 ditched in the Mediterranean. 4 landed in neutral Switzerland. 5 crashed attempting emergency landings at Italian airfields. But 122 survived. And of the 30 aircraft that carried Keller's fuel blend, 29 made it to Africa. Only 1 had ditched, and that was due to battle damage, not fuel starvation. The numbers were striking, but nobody was looking at them yet. In the chaos of arrival, sorting aircraft, treating wounded, accounting for missing crews, nobody noticed the pattern. Keller learned about the mission results 3 days later. The intelligence summary came through channels, detailed losses, noted fuel problems, mentioned that several aircraft had ditched due to fuel exhaustion, while others landed with surprising reserves. The report didn't explain why some aircraft had more fuel than others, but Keller knew. He also knew he'd committed a court-martial offence, unauthorized fuel modification, theft of military property, violation of engine operating protocols. If anyone investigated, he was finished. But investigating meant admitting that standard fuel loads were inadequate for the mission. It meant admitting that planners had sent crews out with insufficient margins. It meant asking uncomfortable questions about why a mechanic with a stolen fuel blend had saved lives that regulation procedures couldn't save. So nobody investigated. The mission was declared a success. The factory at Regensburg was severely damaged. The cost was acceptable by strategic bombing standards. The fuel issues were noted as lessons learned for future planning, and Keller's 30 aircraft, with their unauthorized fuel, disappeared into the statistics. Except Lieutenant O'Brien remembered. And O'Brien talked to other pilots in his squadron, and those pilots talked to their crew chiefs, and within 2 weeks, 5 other mechanics were asking Keller about his fuel blend, quietly, unofficially. Just in case another long-range mission came up, the second Schweinfurt raid came on October 14, 1943. 291 B-17 seconds attacked the ball-bearing factories deep in Germany. No shuttle mission this time. They'd bomb and return to England. But the distance was nearly as far as Regensburg, and fuel would again be critical. Keller and his network of mechanics prepared 58 aircraft with the blend. Not officially, not with authorization. They worked at night, moved fuel in, unmarked drums, kept no records. The mission was a disaster. 60 bombers lost, 20% of the force. But every aircraft with Keller's blend that survived the German fighters made it back to England. The ones running standard fuel weren't so lucky. 4 ran out of fuel over the English Channel. 3 crash-landed in France with empty tanks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. After Schweinfurt, the deep penetration missions stopped. The losses were unsustainable. The 8th Air Force needed long-range fighters before it could return to Germany. The P-51 Mustang would solve that problem eventually. But fuel would remain a concern throughout the war. Range, consumption, octane ratings. The margins were always tight. Keller's fuel blend never became official. No engineering report, no field modification order. It existed in the grey zone, between regulation and necessity, between what the manual said and what actually worked. Other mechanics adopted it, modified it, experimented with ratios. By mid-1944, at least 6 different bomber groups were using locally blended fuel for maximum range missions. The practice was known but not acknowledged. As long as engines didn't fail and aircraft returned, nobody asked questions. Robert Keller survived the war. He returned to Standard Oil in 1945, worked as a refinery supervisor, retired in 1972. He never spoke publicly about the fuel blend. When asked about his service, he'd say he kept airplanes flying, which was true. He just didn't mention how. Lieutenant James O'Brien flew 34 combat missions, survived them all, returned to Oklahoma in 1944. He kept in touch with Keller for 40 years. Every year, on August 17th, O'Brien would call Keller and say the same thing. "Thanks for the gas, Dutch." And Keller would respond, "You would have made it anyway." Both of them knew that wasn't true. The Regensburg mission remains one of the most controversial operations in 8th Air Force history. The planning was flawed. The fuel margins were inadequate. The losses were severe. But it demonstrated something important. American forces could strike anywhere in occupied Europe. The psychological impact on Germany was significant. If the Americans could hit Regensburg, nowhere was safe. What the mission also demonstrated, though this was never officially acknowledged, was that regulations written in offices couldn't always account for combat reality. Engineers at Wright Field designed fuel specifications for normal operations. They didn't account for 9-hour missions with continuous fighter attacks and formation flying at high altitude. The mechanics who actually maintained the aircraft, who actually understood fuel consumption under real combat conditions, knew better. The tension between official procedures and practical necessity defined much of the ground war in maintenance. Crew chiefs regularly modified aircraft in ways that violated technical orders. Armourers jury-rigged gun mounts. Radio operators bypassed official communications procedures. Everyone bent rules when lives were at stake. Most of these modifications were never documented. They existed as tribal knowledge, passed mechanic to mechanic, squadron to squadron. Keller's fuel blend was one of dozens, maybe hundreds, of unauthorized modifications that kept the 8th Air Force flying. Some were brilliant innovations, some were desperate expedients. All shared one characteristic: they worked better than the official solution. And because they worked, they were tolerated, quietly, unofficially, as long as nobody made too much noise about them. The deeper truth was that the Air Force command structure didn't want to know. Acknowledging unauthorized modifications meant admitting that official procedures were inadequate. It meant opening investigations that would reveal uncomfortable facts about mission planning and aircraft limitations. It was easier to look the other way, to let mechanics do what they needed to do, and to focus on mission results rather than methods. This created a strange duality. On paper, everything followed regulations. Maintenance logs showed standard procedures. Fuel records indicated regulation-grade gasoline. Inspection reports certified compliance with technical orders. But on the flight line, reality was different. Mechanics used non-standard parts, blended fuels, modified systems. Pilots learned which aircraft had which unofficial upgrades and requested those planes for difficult missions. The system worked because everyone involved understood the unspoken agreement. Don't put it in writing. Don't make it official. Don't force anyone to make a decision that might have to be defended later. Just do what needs doing and let the results speak for themselves. Keller's legacy wasn't his fuel blend. Dozens of engineers could have developed better formulations with proper time and resources. His legacy was the demonstration that ground-level innovation could solve problems that command-level planning missed. He saw a problem, calculated a solution, took personal risk to implement it, and saved lives. That pattern repeated across every theatre of the war, in every service branch, wherever practical people encountered impractical regulations. The question his actions raised was never answered. Should military organizations prioritize strict adherence to procedures, or should they encourage field innovation when regulations prove inadequate? The answer matters because wars aren't won by following rules. They're won by adapting faster than the enemy. And adaptation often means breaking rules that no longer serve their purpose. In Keller's case, The rule he broke was designed to prevent engine damage from incompatible fuels. The concern was legitimate. Using wrong fuel grades could destroy engines worth thousands of dollars. But the rule assumed normal operations. It didn't account for missions where fuel exhaustion meant ditching in the ocean with a 90% fatality rate. When the cost of following rules exceeded the cost of breaking them, Keller chose survival over compliance. No investigation ever discovered his actions. The blended fuel looked identical to standard fuel. It smelled the same, had the same color, passed basic field tests. Without sophisticated laboratory analysis, it was indistinguishable. And nobody with authority to order such analysis wanted to find anything that would complicate the narrative of mission success. So the truth stayed hidden. 30 aircraft with unauthorized fuel, 29 successful arrivals in Africa, a mechanic who stole fighter fuel to blend a better mixture, and 300 men who lived because someone broke regulations at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way. Years later, when aviation historians studied the Schweinfurt-Regensburg missions, they noted the fuel problems. They documented aircraft that ditched due to fuel starvation. They calculated theoretical fuel consumption and noticed discrepancies with actual results. Some researchers noted that certain squadrons had better fuel performance than others, but attributed it to better pilot technique or aircraft condition. Nobody discovered the blend. The evidence was consumed in engine fires and Mediterranean waves. The drums behind the hangar were emptied and returned to supply. The mechanics who helped Keller never spoke about it, not even after the war. Some secrets stay secret not because they're protected, but because nobody's looking for them. Robert Dutch Keller died in 1996 at age 78. His obituary mentioned his wartime service as an aircraft mechanic with the 394th Bomb Group. It did not mention the fuel blend. It did not mention the night of August 16, 43, when he topped off 30 fuel tanks with an unauthorized mixture. It did not mention that he broke regulations to save lives. In his garage in Bayonne, New Jersey, there's a metal toolbox with his name stenciled on the side. Inside that toolbox, among the wrenches and pliers and measuring tools, there's a small notebook. On one page, dated August 15, 1943, there's a chemical formula, ratios, octane ratings, specific gravity measurements. The calculations that determined how to blend two types of aviation fuel to extract 8% better fuel efficiency. Nobody has opened that notebook since Keller died. His children kept it as a memento. They don't know what the numbers mean. To them, it's just another artifact from a father who worked with aircraft. They don't know it represents 30 crews, 300 men, who made it to North Africa on fuel that regulations said they couldn't use. The B-17 Flying Fortress, nip and tuck, tail number 4230196, completed its mission to Africa, returned to England 3 days later, and flew 47 more combat missions before being retired in June 1944. It was scrapped in December of that year. No record mentions that on one mission, in August 1943, it flew on fuel blended by a mechanic who wasn't supposed to do that. Hell's Kitchen, Lieutenant O'Brien's aircraft, flew 62 missions, survived the war, returned to the United States in November 1945. It was eventually sold for scrap in Arizona. O'Brien kept a piece of the cockpit throttle quadrant. On it, he'd scratched 4 words. Dutch's gas got us home. The lesson of Keller's fuel blend isn't about chemistry. It's about the gap between what systems plan for and what reality demands. Every complex organization faces this gap. Procedures are written based on expected conditions. But conditions change. Missions get harder. Requirements get tighter. Margins disappear. And when that happens, somebody has to make a choice. Follow the rules and accept the consequences, or break the rules and risk punishment for doing what actually needs doing. Keller chose the second option. He accepted personal risk to give crews a better chance. He stole fuel, violated engine operating procedures, falsified maintenance records, and endangered his career. And in doing so, he saved lives that regulations couldn't save. The irony is that his solution wasn't particularly innovative. Any competent fuel chemist could have developed the blend. The innovation was the willingness to implement it without authorization. That willingness defined the difference between theoretical solutions and actual solutions. Theory requires approval. Reality requires action. The larger question remains: how many other mechanics made similar choices? How many unauthorized modifications kept aircraft flying? How many field expedients solved problems that official channels couldn't address? The answer is unknowable because successful unauthorized actions leave no traces. They disappear into mission statistics as unexplained variances, slightly better performance, marginally higher survival rates. But they mattered. In aggregate, across thousands of aircraft and hundreds of missions, those small unauthorized improvements added up. They represented the difference between a force that followed procedures and lost, and a force that adapted and won. Robert Keller never received recognition for his fuel blend. He never sought it. To him, it was just part of the job. Keep the aircraft flying, keep the crews alive, do what needs doing. Everything else was paperwork. The story of Dutch Keller's fuel blend raises a question that military historians have debated for decades. What role did unauthorized innovation play in Allied victory? The official histories focus on strategy, logistics, industrial production. They document approved modifications, sanctioned, changes, official improvements. But wars aren't won only by what appears in reports. They're won by sergeants who ignore regulations, mechanics who bend rules, pilots who trust their crews more than their manuals. Keller wasn't unique. He was part of a shadow network of problem solvers who operated outside official channels because official channels moved too slowly. In the 8th Air Force alone, dozens of mechanics were running similar experiments, mixing oil additives to reduce engine wear at high altitude, adjusting turbocharger wastegate settings beyond specifications to gain a few hundred feet of ceiling, rewiring electrical systems to prevent failures that killed crews when guns froze. None of this appeared in maintenance logs. Technical inspectors would find aircraft in perfect compliance during formal reviews. But after the inspector left, crew chiefs would reinstall their modifications. Pilots knew which aircraft had which upgrades. They'd request specific tail numbers for difficult missions. The squadron operations officer would approve the requests without asking why. Everyone understood the game. The culture of unauthorized modification existed because the official procurement and approval system couldn't keep pace with combat evolution. When the 8th Air Force began operations in 1942, German fighters attacked from behind and below. By mid-1943, they'd switched to head-on attacks. The solution was obvious: add forward-firing guns to the B-17's nose. But getting approval for design changes, manufacturing new parts, installing them in existing aircraft, took months. Mechanics couldn't wait months. They improvised gun mounts from scrap metal, installed additional machine guns in positions that weren't designed for them, jury-rigged ammunition feeds. The results were crude but effective. When Boeing finally released the B-17G with its factory-installed chin turret in September 1943, it incorporated many features that mechanics had already invented in the field. The official modification validated what ground crews already knew. Sometimes the best solutions come from the people actually working the problem. Keller's fuel blend followed this pattern. He identified a problem that official channels hadn't addressed. He developed a solution using available resources. He tested it carefully. He implemented it, knowing the personal risk. And he succeeded where regulation procedures would have failed. The risk was real. If even one engine had failed due to the modified fuel, the entire operation would have been exposed. Keller would face court-martial. The other mechanics involved would be charged as accomplices. The pilots who knew about it might face discipline for accepting unauthorized modifications. Careers would end, reputations would be destroyed, and the 8th Air Force would issue directives making it clear that unauthorized fuel modifications were absolutely forbidden under any circumstances. But Keller had calculated not just the chemistry, but the politics. He knew that if the blend worked, nobody would investigate. Success erases questions. Only failures get examined. His gamble was that 30 aircraft would perform better than expected, and in the chaos of mission results, nobody would ask why. He was right. The post-mission analysis focused on losses, battle damage, bombing accuracy. Fuel consumption was noted as within expected parameters with some variation. The variation was attributed to differences in pilot technique, aircraft weight, formation position. Nobody dug deeper. The fuel system officer filed his report, noted that future long-range missions should plan for higher fuel consumption, and moved on to the next problem. What Keller couldn't know at the time was how close his calculations had been to disaster. The fuel blend worked, but barely. The tolerance margin was approximately 3%. If he'd mixed the ratios slightly wrong, if the octane rating had been 2 points lower, if the engine operating temperatures had been 50 degrees different, the results could have been catastrophic. Several engines might have detonated under high power settings, aircraft might have crashed on takeoff, the entire mission could have been aborted due to mechanical failures. The difference between success and failure was Keller's expertise. He understood fuel chemistry at a level that most mechanics didn't. His years at Standard Oil had taught him how different hydrocarbons behaved under varying temperature and pressure conditions. He knew that aviation fuel wasn't just about octane rating, it was about vapor pressure, freezing point, aromatic content, lead concentration. Change one parameter and you affected others. The blend had to be balanced across multiple characteristics. He'd done the calculations on scraps of paper, sitting in the barracks at night, using slide rules and reference tables he'd kept from his refinery days. The other mechanics watched him work and didn't fully understand what he was doing. They trusted his expertise because they'd seen his results. When Keller said an engine would last another 50 hours, it lasted another 50 hours. When he said a fuel pump was failing, it failed within a week. He had credibility. That credibility was essential because the fuel blend required trust. The pilots who flew with Keller's fuel were trusting him with their lives. They couldn't verify his calculations. They couldn't test the fuel independently. They had to believe that this mechanic, who was violating regulations and risking court-martial, knew what he was doing better than the engineers at Wright Field who wrote the specifications. Lieutenant O'Brien had made that calculation explicitly. When Keller explained the fuel blend, O'Brien asked the right question, not whether it was approved, but whether it would work. O'Brien understood that approval meant nothing at 25,000 feet, over the Mediterranean. Only results mattered. He bet his life and his crew's lives on Keller's judgment. And Keller delivered. But O'Brien wasn't gambling blindly. He'd watched Keller work for months. He'd seen how Keller approached problems, how he tested solutions, how he double-checked his work. O'Brien knew that Keller wasn't a cowboy taking reckless chances. He was a professional, solving a problem that official channels couldn't address in time. This relationship between pilots and mechanics was fundamental to how the 8th Air Force functioned. The official chain of command flowed through officers and formal procedures, but the actual operation of combat aircraft depended on trust relationships between pilots and their crew chiefs. Pilots needed to know their aircraft were properly maintained. Crew chiefs needed pilots who would report problems honestly and fly aircraft the way they were designed to be flown. When that trust existed, both sides could take risks that regulations prohibited. Keller built that trust through competence and consistency. His aircraft had the lowest mechanical abort rate in the squadron. His engines ran smoothly. His electrical systems didn't fail. When he said an aircraft was ready to fly, it was ready to fly. So when he said he had a fuel blend that would extend range, pilots believed him. The trust network extended beyond individual pilot-mechanic relationships. By August 1943, the mechanics in the 394th Bomb Group functioned as a semi-autonomous unit within the official command structure. They coordinated among themselves, shared solutions, covered for each other. When one crew chief needed a non-standard part, others would scrounge it from damaged aircraft or borrow it from other squadrons. When an aircraft needed work that violated technical orders, they'd do it at night and forge the inspection paperwork. The officers knew this was happening. The squadron engineering officer wasn't stupid. He could see that aircraft were performing better than specifications predicted. He noticed that mechanical failure rates were lower than official statistics suggested they should be. But he also knew that investigating would create problems he didn't want to deal with, so he maintained plausible deniability. As long as the aircraft kept flying and the mission success rate remained high, he didn't ask questions. This unofficial tolerance created space for innovation. Keller and mechanics like him could experiment, test solutions, implement improvements without bureaucratic interference. The cost was personal risk. If anything went wrong, they'd face punishment. But the benefit was the ability to solve real problems in real time, rather than waiting for official channels to maybe, eventually, authorize changes. The fuel blend was Keller's most significant innovation, but not his only one. Over his 2 years with the 394th, he developed dozens of small improvements. A modification to oil cooler baffles that reduced engine temperatures by 8 degrees. A rewiring of the oxygen system that reduced failures by 30%. A bracket design that prevented machine gun feed systems from jamming at high altitude. None of these modifications appeared in official records. All of them saved lives. Other mechanics developed their own innovations. Sergeant Mike Russo at the 395th figured out how to modify turbocharger regulators to give engines an extra 200 horsepower at altitude without damaging them. Sergeant Tom Chen at the 91st developed a fuel tank sealing compound that was more effective than the official sealant. Sergeant Bill Morrison at the 306th created an electrical heating system for gun positions that actually worked, unlike the standard system that failed constantly. These innovations spread through informal networks. Mechanics talked to each other at the enlisted mess, shared drawings on napkins, demonstrated techniques in the maintenance hangars. Good ideas propagated quickly. Bad ideas were identified and abandoned before they caused problems. The system was self-correcting because the mechanics who implemented modifications bore the consequences if they failed. This informal innovation network was one of the significant advantages Allied forces had over German forces. The Luftwaffe maintenance system was more rigid, more hierarchical, more dependent on official approval. German mechanics who identified problems had to submit reports through channels and wait for engineering command to authorize solutions. This made sense for an air force designed to fight short campaigns with clear supply lines. It made less sense for sustained combat operations where conditions changed constantly. The American approach was messier, but more adaptive. Mechanics had more autonomy, more access to resources, more tolerance for improvisation. This created waste and inefficiency in some areas. But it also created innovation and adaptation that formal systems couldn't match. Keller's fuel blend was a perfect example. A field mechanic solved a problem in 2 weeks that would have taken official channels 6 months to address, if they addressed it at all. The irony was that after the war, when the Air Force studied what made the 8th Air Force successful, they focused on strategic bombing doctrine, formation tactics, fighter escort development. The role of unauthorized field modifications barely appeared in official histories. The mechanics who made those modifications weren't interviewed. Their innovations weren't documented. The institutional knowledge that made combat operations possible was lost as the mechanics returned to civilian life. Keller went back to Standard Oil and never spoke publicly about his wartime work. When asked, he'd say he was a mechanic in England. If pressed, he'd mention that he worked on B-17 seconds. He wouldn't discuss the fuel blend, the unauthorized modifications, the rules he broke. To him, it wasn't worth discussing. It was just the job. You saw a problem. You fixed it. Everything else was unnecessary complication. That attitude was typical of his generation. They did extraordinary things and considered them ordinary. They took personal risks and dismissed them as nothing special. They saved lives and shrugged it off as just doing what needed doing. The contrast with modern military culture is striking. Today's forces document everything, seek recognition for achievements, emphasize individual contributions. Keller's generation did the opposite. They kept quiet, avoided attention, disappeared into anonymity. But their contributions matter historically because they reveal how organizations actually function under pressure. The official structure provides framework and resources. The unofficial network provides adaptation and innovation. Both are necessary. Neither is sufficient alone. Understanding this duality is essential to understanding how the 8th Air Force and military forces generally achieve success despite chaos, uncertainty, and imperfect information. Robert Keller's fuel blend saved 30 crews on August 17, 1943. It probably saved others on subsequent missions. The total number of lives preserved by his unauthorized innovation will never be known precisely. But the fact that the number exists, that real people lived because one mechanic decided regulations were less important than results, that fact tells us something important about how wars are actually won. Not by following rules, by knowing when to break them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.